Okay, so welcome to this latest video in the series that we're doing on the monitoring implications of the Environment Act 2021. You may have seen previous videos that we've done. We've interviewed Philip Dunn, MP, Chair of the Environmental Audit Committee, who told us about how the Environment Act developed and resulted in this new water quality monitoring requirement. We've also spoken with Wilfred Deng at Severn Trent Water, who talked about the subject from a water company's perspective. And then more recently, we spoke to Matt Lowenthal, who worked with the Environment Agency for many years with responsibility for water quality monitoring of rivers. So that was also very relevant. And today I'm delighted to have with me Simon Browning. Simon is Monitoring Technical Lead at the Rivers Trust. It's great to have Simon on the program. I've known him for a long time. Our paths first crossed. I dread to think how many years ago when there were the floods in Somerset. Simon was actually involved with the monitoring that took place, real-time continuous monitoring upstream and downstream of the dredging that subsequently took place following the terrible flooding that happened in Somerset. So he's obviously the perfect person to talk to about river water quality monitoring. So thank you so much for joining us, Simon.
Welcome, Graham. Thank you for having me on.
I wonder if we could start with, for those people who may not know, if you could give us a brief description of the Rivers Trust and what its main areas of work are.
Yeah, sure. So the Rivers Trust is a charity, and I work for the national umbrella body, so the Rivers Trust. That kind of is almost like a support organisation in many ways for the member trusts. So across the country now, across England, Wales and Ireland and Scotland, there are Rivers Trusts that cover pretty much the whole country, and there's about 65 of them. Individual Rivers Trusts will cover certain areas. So previously I worked for West Country Rivers Trust, and they tend to be different sizes with different levels of expertise. So West Country Rivers Trust, I think, has its 30th anniversary next year, whereas there was Rivers Trust also just formed this year. So part of the Rivers Trust movement is to kind of help support those organisations so we can raise the level of effectiveness, if you like, across the board. So some Rivers Trusts have more support from us than others. There's also fairly recently, I suppose, the Rivers Trust has taken on that national kind of lobbying role. So with our communications and working with other NGOs in groups like the Wildlife and Countryside Link to kind of provide that national voice for rivers across the piece.
Okay, great, thanks. And with all your experience, I wonder if you could also briefly summarise for us what you perceive as the main factors affecting river water quality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, over the years, working in particularly rural sectors of the country, we see an awful lot of runoff from agriculture. I mean, if you look at the Water Framework Directive data, I recommend having a look at the State of the Rivers report done by the Rivers Trust a couple of years ago. It breaks down the Environment Agency's Water Framework Directive data, and broadly speaking, 40% of rivers fail due to sewage inputs and water company inputs. Another 40% or so is down to farming, and then there's a bit of overlap there with sort of runoff from industrial areas or runoff from urban areas, road runoff. So when you break that down, some of the pollutants are the same. So nutrients are an issue from farming as they are from sewage, both treated and raw. But there's also then a lot of chemicals, industrial chemicals, whether that's pesticides or things used in manufacture. We've seen the PFOS, forever chemicals coming to the fore now that they're ubiquitous now. They're sort of everywhere. But then other issues are really things like sedimentation. Just soil runoff from bare farmland actually causes a huge problems for our rivers, smothering gravels, bringing nutrients and chemicals with it. So yeah, there's a lot of factors, and of course, in recent years we've also seen climate change. Really hot, dry periods where river flows are much lower. The temperatures get a lot warmer, and so all those chemicals that enter the system are that much more active and that much more harmful to the wildlife that lives in our rivers. So still plenty of stuff upsetting our rivers, I'm afraid.
And talking of nutrients, it wasn't very long ago that nutrients and algal blooms were the hot topic, but that seems to have subsided a little lately. Is that just because it's out of the news, or is it still the problem that it's always been or has been of late?
I think it's certainly, I mean, it's definitely one of the big issues on the River Wye. We see that a lot in the news, you know, the River Wye turning into this kind of green algal soup. Again, a lot of my sort of on the ground river experience is in the West Country, where we don't see that so much as an issue because we have very short, fast flowing rivers. So even if they have the nutrient concentrations in, you don't get that time to build up the sort of the eutrophication impact before it's out to sea. So, but we do still see nutrient blooms in estuaries, you know, where that impact kind of accumulates, and it's definitely be an issue in some of the longer, larger, slower flowing rivers across, you know, particularly on the eastern side of the country.
And presumably, the Rivers Trusts are delighted with the amount of monitoring that's going to be required by the Environment Act, because it'll shed a light on water quality over the whole country.
It's been quite a ride the last couple of years, you know, and tracing it back to things like, you know, the event duration monitoring data being released. So, you know, we've seen the state of our rivers on the front pages like never before, and that's obviously then transmitted itself into the political space, which is absolutely fantastic. You know, it's something I've been working in rivers, gosh, probably 25 years now, and it's brilliant to see it hitting the headlines in that way. The Environment Act monitoring is a direct result of that, which is also great to see, you know, that kind of people power influencing environment legislation. And it's amazing also to see that environmental monitoring, again, something we've been calling for improved and increased monitoring for a long time, you know, right up there and pride of place in the legislation. It's incredible to see the amount of money that is predicted to be, you know, that the monitoring sort of dictated by the government is going to cost. You know, the water industry is saying around £5 or £6 billion per AMP period, so perhaps almost like £1 billion a year to install and maintain and sometimes buy land to site these sensors. So there's an awful lot. It's a real huge step change in the number of sensors, complicated sensors too, that will be out there in the world. But yeah, it's fantastic to see that being talked about and being put into legislation, that increased focus on monitoring, that acknowledgement that rivers are complicated, they need that level of technology to have a look at them. Some of the other things that are really good about the legislation are that there's an acknowledgement right out front there that data should be made public in near real time. So it's not going squirreled away in some government or water industry database somewhere to be, you know, never looked at. Yeah. That data needs to be made public on accessible websites and also interpreted in such a way that people can understand it. So we're really looking forward to playing a role in making, you know, helping that data land with the public so we can kind of help people understand what's going on.
And an aspect of that I'm particularly interested in is, I know that the Rivers Trust has a lot of volunteers. Yeah, you're heavily involved with citizen science. I know you're involved with the Catchment Systems Thinking Cooperative, for example. So there's a bit of challenge there, presumably, on integrating formal water quality monitoring networks and citizen science. Do you think that the two can merge in some way?
Absolutely, and that's something we've been talking to all sorts of partners about over the last few months, is what a role citizen science can play alongside that very tech-heavy kind of, you know, data-rich data that will be coming from the sensors. You've got some really complicated things going on. You know, you'll be looking at upstream, downstream, concentrations of things like dissolved oxygen, turbidity, ammonia, and we know there are issues with ammonium sensors that it's going to be really difficult sometimes to pick out an impact from upstream to downstream, depending on the state of the receiving water course. We also know that where you place those sondes is absolutely crucial. You know, if you get one result, if you put it, you know, in the final effluent or 2 meters downstream, but that's not necessarily representative at all of the river. So how far do you go downstream? And also we know that the places where kind of the dissolved oxygen impact, so we might be getting dissolved oxygen fluctuations due to eutrophication, that won't be in the same place as the peak ammonia is seen. So there's some real struggle around placement of these sensors. And of course, the view then of the public is how we make that clear to them that all these things are going on. So where I think we can get to with citizen science, and we're already seeing this all over the place, the data that people can collect themselves, particularly on things like impact. So those visual impacts. So you talked about algal blooms, you know, kind of visual sewage-related litter, sedimentation, ragging in trees, all those kind of things are a real sort of absolutely clear-cut example of adverse impact of a sewage treatment works or a CSO discharge. Those are things that actually the Environment Agency understand really well in terms of pollution reporting, people understand really well. So you've got this balance between the complicated time series data that's going to be interpreted in all sorts of ways, it will need to be, and then the very clear-cut, people can see it, smell it, not quite taste it, but they can sort of detect that stuff in very very obvious ways. And I think that's a really useful balance. I know as well that one of the issues with the way the Section 82 monitoring is planned is it's very, very focused on sewage treatment works and sewage, storm overflow assets, which is great. There's a lot going on there, but it does kind of miss a whole section, as I mentioned before, 40% or so of rivers that are failing due to agricultural inputs. So again, there's going to be work done on trying to eke out that kind of interpretation. What impact is farming having from sensors that might be upstream of the highest sewage treatment works, which is a kind of a secondary way of doing it, but nonetheless. So again, in terms of us all, water companies, NGOs, public, understanding where the real problems are for their particular catchment, I think citizen science on top of and in harmony with the continuous monitoring will be a really powerful tool.
And does the citizen science that the rivers trusts are involved with also involve biological assessments? So, you could say, oh, it's all very well measuring the chemistry of the water, but at the end of the day, what effect is that having on the organisms that live in the rivers? Do they call them kick tests or something? I can't remember what it's called, but
so the CASCO project that I'm working on is in partnership with several other rivers trusts, wildlife trust, and water companies, as well as academic experts and people like the Freshwater Biological Association. So we're looking at essentially what citizen science tools are out there to start with, how we then kind of benchmark those against each other so we can understand the sort of the consistency and the quality of that data, so that whether it's a water company or local environmental groups or the Environment Agency making decisions about water management and what the issues are, they can trust that data and they can trust that across the piece, almost no matter who it's collected by. Now, one of the longest running, if you like, citizen science schemes that's been going for a long time and is very well established and very well understood by the Environment Agency is what's called the Anglers River Fly Monitoring Initiative, or ARMI for short, or some people just call it Riverfly. And yes, that's a system of kick samples, so a 3-minute sort of scuffing up the riverbed, catching what comes out in a net, and then going to the bankside and sorting that catch, looking for 8 distinct species. And that can tell you, it's designed really to tell you, so the number of species goes to kind of create a score, and each site has a trigger level set by the Environment Agency. If it goes below that score, we know that something's happened since the last survey. But you're right, those kind of biological assessments tell us a lot about what the impact of whatever sources are upon the water body, because there's a lot, again, that isn't covered by the Environment Act monitoring. So the 5 parameters plus the wild card, if you like, dissolved oxygen, conductivity, ammonia, turbidity, and pH. Nothing in there about industrial chemicals, nitrate and phosphate, heavy metals, microplastics, pharmaceuticals, some really concerning chemicals that if you or I were swimming in the river, we want to know about them. And for sure, the critters living in the rivers will want to know about them, are not covered at all by this new legislation. It's also worth mentioning that neither of those routinely sampled for at the final effluent. So again, there's a very small, so there is still a big area of uncertainty around what's in our rivers. And whilst I'd really like to see more sampling and analysis for those kind of things, which are really difficult, there aren't really viable sensor technologies for those at the moment. So there should be more sampling for those. But the health of the river invertebrates is a really useful way of, again, getting that very detailed information at with fairly low technology, and volunteers, again, who can be very knowledgeable about their local patch.
Well, I suppose you could, we could be quite hopeful in that this whole issue is going to force so much money through the water quality instrumentation sector that one would assume that that's going to prompt some innovation in water quality monitoring. So, phosphates and nitrates, those have got to be the next two to do quite easily, I would have thought. PFAS and all that kind of thing. I can't imagine anytime soon anybody's going to have a real-time monitor for those in the tiny amounts that you need to measure. But hopefully some of these other bigger issues, well, not bigger, but easier to resolve issues can be sorted out in the short term. But
yeah, I think we're definitely, we will see a huge, I think we're already seeing evidence of, increased innovation in the water sector. It's one we bemoan a little bit for using similar technologies across many of these sensing devices that were in play, when I first started 25, 30 years ago. So that's very exciting. And also, don't forget the citizen science in that space. We're seeing some really interesting techniques that are suitable for kind of almost like a hybrid, sort of a citizen sampling effort. So some of the eDNA testing can be, the sample can be taken by volunteers, it's filtered through a medium, fixed, and then sent off for analysis. The same with, we can see some of the exotic, PFAS, PFOS being done in a similar way, filtered through a medium that stabilizes the contaminant and then can be sent away. So that kind of hybrid, citizen sampling in the absence of citizen science tools to do the analysis, I think is also going to be really powerful.
So does anybody watching this that like to get involved and help their local rivers trust? What do they do?
Get in touch with them. So you can find out who that is on our website, or you might already know via their website, and just ask for sort of volunteering opportunities. So they don't all offer water quality testing, but they mostly offer sort of volunteer opportunities, which can lead to that kind of thing. Right. It's something the Casco project is aiming to do, is to make it easier for whatever group it is to get involved in testing their local watercourse, collecting useful data that's consistent and valuable then to people like the Environment Agency or water companies or local environmental groups. We see an awful lot of existing groups, whether it's the Friends of X, Y, and Z, or local nature and environmental groups coming together as a group and looking at their local catchment and being able then to, from right out the back, and kind of monitor water quality across the whole catchment, which then actually enables them to go and do something about it. If they can then see from that data that it's the local farming community or the local sewage treatment works, they know where they can go to, so they can have discussions with their local landowners, they can lobby the water companies, talk to MPs, talk to the local councils. I think we need to get used to, in this country, having a lot more sort of say in our local rivers ourselves, not leaving it to the Environment Agency. We know they're overstretched, we know they don't have the resources on the ground, but we also know that politicians and councillors do respond now, increasingly so, to kind of calls for action about their local watercourses. So there's a real, and I think having a data set in your back pocket, if you like, that can demonstrate that you know what you're talking about as a community group is also really useful.
Okay, and the last thing I wanted to ask you was, what's your view on how the data from the water quality monitoring networks can help with some of the key things that you do, engaging with farmers, inspiring children, improving our understanding of water quality status generally, prioritizing water quality improvement initiatives, and measuring the effectiveness of mitigation and improvement measures? And that's a big question, I know. There's lots of sub-elements to it, but how do you think the data, because as you said, it's an enormous amount of data that's going to be created. How can it help with some of those key issues?
I mean, I suppose the general point is, and this is something I've been banging on about to anyone who will listen for years and years, is that when you are designing a monitoring program, it's really important to have those objectives clear in your mind or on a piece of paper, because actually the way the monitoring is set out, what monitoring technology, where it goes, what it does, where the data ends up, is absolutely key to be able to make the most of that data. And I suppose that's where what we see here is a monitoring network, if you like, designed very much around a single issue, if you like, the impact of sewage treatment or storm overflows on our river bodies. So yes, we might be able to use it for all those other things. I can't remember exactly what they were, but it's not designed for that. So that's going to be a little bit of a fudge. And for example, the translation of those 5 key parameters in real time, upstream and downstream, into something that children can understand is going to be a big challenge. In terms of engaging with farmers, again, it's a slight mismatch there. And so I think what is missing, if you like, and is a bit unbalanced in my view, is that we're saying, we know that one sector in particular has a big impact on rivers, and we're going to do a lot of monitoring to unearth what that is. But at the same time, all these other things, we're not really doing anything on that. So I'd like to see a bit of balance, that as well as having clusters of sensors around water treatment works and sewage assets, we also acknowledge that we need some of those where they aren't. So almost, in every water body. So there's 4,000 water bodies in England and Wales, possibly. And we could have a sensor in each of those just to give us that kind of health check that everything is rosy or not. Are we getting dissolved oxygen problems, ammonia issues, sediment issues where there aren't sewage inputs? And I think that level of data then is much more easily translated into kind of educating people about what goes on in rivers. They are very complicated. So one of the things we try and combat a lot is people want to get involved in testing their local river. They think it's a kind of one and done thing. They go and take a test of their river, they get a result, and that means it's good or bad or what. So getting that across, that all those things change on an hourly basis, let alone seasonal and annual and week to week, and in response to rainfall events. So getting across the complexity and what that means in terms of being able to understand, the best scientists in the world don't really understand what goes on our rivers. And so it's a big ask for the general public, but we do want to get across it's more complicated than that kind of idea, and stick with us in terms of understanding how you can kind of learn what you need to make those decisions that affect you. So you'll find, open water swimmers will be very clued into the natural cues, if you like, of when the river is or isn't safe. They probably won't be swimming after rainfall. They'll be on the lookout in low summer flows, because they know intuitively that any chemicals that are coming in are more concentrated in effect. So it definitely it opens up lots of opportunities, but it's not the full story. It's not the full.
Of course, the other thing to mention is, of course, is that not only will this network provide us with baseline levels of water quality across the country, it will also have an alarming capability. So you don't have to, because most of these parameters are indicative parameters of water quality, and so you don't need to know what a healthy level of dissolved oxygen is. But if there's an alarm system and the network says, okay, we've got a sudden drop in DO in this particular place in this particular river, then that's an alert that there's a problem of some sort. You don't necessarily, Joe Boggs doesn't need to necessarily know what that problem is, but they're alerted to the fact that it's there. And also it helps you, it helps those who are responsible for river water quality to identify the source of the problem, so that hopefully it doesn't happen again in the future.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, again, that's partly where, that interpretation of the data. So a lot of people talk about, all we want is a traffic light system. That's kind of difficult. It depends then on what your use of the water body is. Are you looking at, are you considering swimming in that water? Are you a water company who's taking water out then? Because don't forget, in the same system that their sewage discharges into, they also take water out to treat for drinking water. So there will be a lot of useful stuff in there. It's just that we need to know, then it might be that actually the turbidity data is the most reliable kind of indicator, when all's said and done, about whether you make some of those decisions to enter the water or not. And sometimes that can be seen by the naked eye anyway. And so and then there's also this kind of concern about, well, what about the places people swim where there isn't sewage? And people aren't necessarily targeting sewage treatment works downstream of them to go and do their swimming. So what about those other areas that are, can be subject to all sorts of pollutants too? So,
but actually, I was just thinking that the system that you had in Somerset all those years ago is a perfect example of all of this, because as I remember it, if the turbidity level above stream and downstream of the dredging was significantly different, then the dredger's driver would receive a text message saying stop dredging. That's kind of one of the main jobs of this network, I would imagine.
It definitely has that capability, and the technology is such. I mean, that was what, 10 years or so ago. I mean, we had to drive that quite hard, I think, because we wanted, a lot of this stuff runs on hourly or 15-minute intervals. I think we wanted a bit quicker than that. We wanted to know instantly, really. Because it was done in the summer and we know levels were low and there was potential for oxygen crashes. So, but again, it illustrates some of the challenges. I mean, we were using ammonium sensors there, and ammonium sensors haven't really changed that much in that time. They can be really tricky to kind of to have stable and accurate at the same time, so they're prone to drift. But again, it was interesting because that relative, difference between upstream and downstream does get you out of jail in a certain extent, as long as they're calibrated and they're operating, consistently with each other. Then the absolute accuracy wasn't really such a concern. And I think there is that potential in this legislation to look at those absolute differences, or the relative differences rather than the absolute ones.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, Simon, we could talk all day on this, but, yes. But it's very good of you to give me so much of your time. I'm really grateful.
No problem.
And hope to see you soon.
Yeah, thanks very much.
Cheers.